Do you know the history of paperbacks?
This is the first time I've been taking notes during an interview.
By 1818, we have 2,400 pages per hour. A lot of authors made their break by selling rights that they had retained. Stephen King, he had success in one of his early books with hardcover, but he only had a 2,500 advance. After the success, he sold his rights for the paperback version for...
Oh, hell yeah. Stephen King, you rule.
One of my ideas is that there's gonna be a flippening. People are gonna put eBooks out, or at least retain status. Then it's gonna be...
I think people underestimate how mind-blowing the technology of on-demand paperback printing is.
I'm actually betting on this. I am releasing a super high-end version of the Pathless Path. And so my idea is I'm gonna compete with what traditional publishers say is their strategic advantage. My name is Paul Miller. I am obsessed with the publishing industry, as every first or second time author inevitably gets sucked into. And I reached out to Eric because I realized that if I had something on my calendar, I could then use it as motivation to go on an absurd deep dive about the history of the book publishing industry. I'll start with some high level conclusions and then we can dive in as we go.
Sure.
So one is books are a industry that has been around since the 1400s. And pretty much steadily since then, books have increased in production and how much they're read, how much they're printed over time. Another thing is the distribution of profit and how that breaks out in book publishing has shifted dramatically, especially since the 1800s. The third thing is authors often got rich by retaining rights, not selling all their rights, which is going to vibe with the scribe outlook.
This is going to vibe with me.
And then another theme I pulled out was that publishers consistently devalue new formats and options. So, any initial reactions, or do you want me to dive in?
Only to feel incredibly vindicated, as one would expect. That all feels right to me from my experience in the industry, and it feels like what is clearly happening because the whole context of the industry has shifted over the last 20 years from the conditions that it had basically for the 100 years before that. No, I love this deep dive. I have no quarrels with any of these conclusions so far, other than that very interesting that you started this far back, 1400s. I think that's really interesting. And I want to hear what's shifted there. And then distribution of profit, I also very fascinating. How has it shifted amongst who, and what were the causes of that?
So Gutenberg style press, we're talking 1600s. But before that, book publishing and printing started in the 1400s. And steadily over the centuries until the 1800s, got slowly faster. But it was mostly hand-operated presses. In 1800, they're doing about 480 pages per hour in a Stanhope press. In the next 20 years, basically steam-powered presses are invented, in which this radically increases the speed of production. And so by 1818, we have 2,400 pages per hour, nearly 5x production. These are also manufacturing equipment, so they can scale much more. So if you look at book production, the 18th century, right before this happens, there's about 1 billion books output. But after that, it basically just keeps increasing and increases even more. And so throughout the 1800s, there's just huge explosion of spreading ideas through books. A lot of what we think of a book publishing now is individual authors, but the start of book publishing is often through what's called trades, right? And we still have this word trade books, but back then they really were trades. So you'd have the engineering discipline and then organize around a trade to basically create and share textbooks, standardized education among people, spread information among that discipline. Lawyers had similar things, education had similar things, etc. And so a lot of the early days of book publishing is around this sort of need at an industry-wide level, less so individual author produces for mass audience.
We would call an industry rag today or something like that, a periodical, or it's a handbook of the trade's wisdom and who was leading and what the innovations were and what the new tools were.
But much higher value then, right? Because you were actually information scarce. Now we live in this information abundant world, so we sort of take these things for granted. Individual authors do start doing things. Throughout the 1800s, there's all sorts of examples. And basically, there's two models. One is author gets royalty of percent of book price, and those range from like 10 to 20%. And or there's profit sharing models, right? One example, 1848, Edgar Allan Poe got 10% royalties for one of his poems, Eureka. Second example, 1856, Ticknor and Fields pays Henry Wadsworth Longfellow 20% of the retail price. But he got a higher royalty because he co-invested in the bookbinding plates, right? And so this gets to some of the cost questions. We have data from 1872. Here's the breakdown. $1 per copy. So how does that distribute? Most of that money in traditional book publishing today is split between the retailer and the publisher. But in 1872, most of it was involved in retail and printing. So 40% go to the retail bookseller. And then 15% to paper, 15% to the bookbinder, and 10% to the printer and stereotyper. And so a lot of what emerged in the original publishing industry is because the cost of goods sold was the highest cost. Yeah. So retailers were able to extract margins because they own distribution. But more expensive was actually the production costs, including paper, bookbinding, and literally like plates. So you had to like buy your own plates. So oftentimes authors would buy or produce the plates to get a higher share of revenue or profits.
That's awesome. That's super interesting.
So we have the author and publisher capturing 20%.
Yep.
And the retail capturing 40%. And then the cost of goods sold capturing another 40%. But here's the current economics of, let's say, a traditional publisher, $30 hardcover. Manufacturing cost of goods sold is about $450. And these are estimates based on various sources I've used. Retail is 45%. And publisher gets about 28% of that $30 and the author gets 13%. So the author gets the lowest margin. Basically shows like publishers are, since they're owning production, they're capturing more of the margin for lowering the production costs over time. And they still capture that.
Like they are benefiting disproportionately from the decrease in cost of goods sold.
Yeah, because they're closer to the distribution. That's what I would say is they own demand.
Yeah, like the black box of COGS is inside the black box of publishing. And so they're able to capture that margin. And authors largely don't necessarily know that it's happening.
So if you cut out the publisher and go self-pub on your own hardcover, it's still somewhat expensive. So the cost of goods sold on $30 hardcover, about $8.20. The distributor, Amazon, gets about 40%. And then the author gets 32%. So the author is closer to the distributor, but Amazon is still getting a pretty big cut for owning demand.
Yeah.
So the process is getting more efficient. And then if you go to paperback, the author actually comes out ahead because paperback technology and the cost is much cheaper than hardcover. So a self-published paperback, the author gets 42%, the distributor gets 40%, and the manufacturing is only 18%.
I think people underestimate how mind-blowing the technology of on-demand paperback printing is. Like how good it is, how fast it is, the fact that not only is it cheaper on a per copy basis, but also one of the big things that went into, like when you hear people talk about manufacturing plates and like the paper, these are all like upfront fixed costs that you have to do in a batch, and you have to amortize the plates over however many books get printed. But now with like digital print on demand, it's trivially expensive to just publish 1 or 100 or 1,000 with no upfront cost. You just print them as literally as they're sold. Most of the money these publishers make are from the deep back catalog.
Yeah.
They're making money today from decisions that were made 20 years ago by probably an entirely different set of leadership and books that were born into an entirely different culture. Like how much money are somebody's still making off of How to Win Friends and Influence People or 7 Habits of Highly Effective People? Like that back catalog is crazy. And they probably paid 10 grand for an asset that's now worth what, $500,000, $1 million a year.
Okay, so in 2020, 67% of all print units purchased were backlist. In 2021, 70% of print sales were backlist. So if you're an author and you're signing with a traditional publisher, you are not the customer. Retail bookstores are, and the backlist.
They're hoping you become a backlist. They can pay as little as possible for your long-term rights, and that you somehow become a lottery ticket winner, and they own, control and royalties forever.
This is a good way of thinking about how a publisher would think. Like they're basically going to put effort in for 3 to 6 months. And then it either has potential to stay on as a backlist or they're just going to ignore it. So one idea is like a marketplace for traditionally published books that have not earned out their advance. This is one thing that just makes me angry on behalf of authors. If they don't earn out their advance, they basically give up promoting the book, which I think is negative for the gross domestic soul of our world. Like we should have creative people championing their work and sharing it with the world. At least like how could they get like the ebook right such that they could lower the price to 99 cents or $4.99, increase demand, and people will be like, oh, this is cool, right? Let's revive this book. I think that is a no-brainer for authors to get back those rights. So I think one thing that was interesting that came up is a lot of authors made their break or made it big by selling rights that they had retained. So Stephen King retained his paperback rights, and that launched his career. Harper Lee, To Kill a Mockingbird. How do you think she made it big? Book deal or something else?
Something else.
Movie rights. So they didn't acquire film adaptation rights at that time. So she retained those and became Brits. Tom Clancy, similar thing. He retained film and international rights, which later earned him millions. The other one, Hugh Howey, self-publishes first, retains his rights, and then options print books to big publishers.
And so we were turning down these huge offers from publishers and we just told them, like, we want to do a print-only deal with a time limit, and I get to keep all the digital rights, all the audio, the rest of the world, but you publish it, the print only, as if it's a major book, book tours, major distribution, all that. And finally, Simon & Schuster said, we'd rather make some money than no money.
I think what's shifted in that, like, I would encourage a lot of people, especially if they own their audience, is to think about negotiating for retaining rights up front.
As many as you can. Remember the counterparty that their goal is to get as much rights as they can for as cheaply as little as they can pay you up front. It's also worth mentioning, like, the dynamics of the agent in this conversation are not what they appear, right? Like, to your point earlier of, like, if you're an author signing with a publisher, you are not the customer. Think about it when you go, as a single author, and you go hire an agent to go negotiate a good deal for you with that publisher. That agent's entire livelihood is based on having good relationships with the 3 to 5 publishers that make their career. That publisher pays the agent hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars over the course of their lifetime. They are not going to burn bridges and fight to the death to get you a good deal. They are going to preserve their relationship with that publisher.
An agent can be a good partner, right? There's nothing stopping them from making that decision on their own to add a lot of value to their clients. But the incentives in the system do not require that. And so I have an agent now for foreign rights, right? I'm using DropCap. I tried to do it on my own, and basically just because of legacy reasons of the industry and the complexity of so many different countries, it was just too hard. So I made $2,000 doing it on my own for like a year, and now I've made $14,500 optioning rights to multiple countries in the last 6 months. Do you know the history of paperbacks?
No, this is crazy, dude. I'm literally, this is the first time I've been like taking notes during an interview. Like, I know that you're reading a thing that you'll send me, and I'm still just like writing all this down as though I have to know all of this.
Paperbacks started as this cheaper way of producing books. So historically, traditional publishers were not interested in paperbacks. They would only sell the hardcover. Hardcovers were synonymous with prestige, literary culture. Like, this is a book, right? A paperback is not a book. Sound familiar, right? This is like what we considered eBooks in the early 2000s. Basically, you have like mass market paperbacks, but they were often like these cheap novels, romance novels. And then you had what was called trade paperback. Now, trade paperback was often published after a successful hardcover and such. But those rights were often sold separately. One famous one is Stephen King. He had success in one of his early books with hardcover, but he only had like a 2,500 advance. His paperback rights were still his. And after the success of the hardcover, he sold his rights for the paperback version to a different publisher for $400,000.
Oh, hell yeah. Stephen King, you rule.
This sort of went on for about like 15, 20 years, from like the 1940s to the 1970s. Basically, the publishers were like, we don't do paperbacks. We're too cool. We're too fancy. We're prestigious, right? And so 1947, 95 million mass market paperbacks. By 1959, 12 years later, there were 286 million mass market paperbacks. And so that was the first time dollar sales of paperbacks exceeded hardcover trade books. Over the 1960s and 1970s, the traditional publishers either acquired these paperback producers or started their own to take advantage of this.
Interesting. Slowly, begrudgingly, which goes back to your like the pattern of them just consistently undervaluing new formats, new ideas.
This is from the History of the Book, Volume 5. Trade publishers were initially leery of paperback publication, fearing that it would cheapen authors' reputations and cut into revenues. So they didn't want to cannibalize their own sales. Both authors and hardcover publishers were reluctant to see their books between the lurid paperback covers in favor in the 1940s and 50s. So they're worried about like reputation management. But by the 1950s, they started to include the right to approve or disprove your paperback cover.
Oh, they wanted control, but not to do any of the work.
Yeah. They just want to make sure it's not like a really crappy cover. I don't know. Let's do a Google search on 1950s fiction covers. Paperback.
Yeah, there's some good looking stuff here. Hank Jensen, Sent from Heaven.
There were a lot of like romance novels, and these are still dominant in the overall
I
book
Prefer
market.
Girls by Jesse Dumont. Yeah, these would make some good posters.
And so eventually they get smart enough to integrate this into the I'm going to publish your book package. But even still, publishers do not put out paperbacks, often with bigger books, in the first print run. I think this ties back to earlier, is that the self-publishing world is like a completely different universe that the traditional book publishers have not learned anything from. And so the self-publishing world has done all sorts of testing and found like what are optimal prices? How do you position books? How do you get books into readers' hands? Right? And so there's a lot of experimentation that is like not actually flowing between the two different worlds. Mm-hmm. And I think one of my predictions for the future is eventually those are going to bleed into each other, because there's just too much money to be made and too much information that's not being collected. This is why I want to retain my rights, because there's just so many things that are changing.
I love that we started so deep into history, because it shows that as technology changes, the structure of the industry changes, and the structure of the industry changes, where the profits accrue move around. And ultimately, the author's share should be expanding over time as everything else gets commoditized. The digital distribution gets commoditized, as point of sale gets commoditized. Amazon is still really like an 800-pound gorilla at this moment of having all of the bookstore demand. But I think that's not necessarily likely to continue permanently. But to your point, like retaining your rights is the high optionality move, especially not letting your rights get controlled by the slowest moving, most dogmatic like actor in the industry is an important thing for navigating these periods of change.
This entire industry is built on the idea that the hardcover is the golden child, and that is prioritized. That matters. All the people that work in book publishing care about this. They work in New York. They care about the literary culture. They care about the bookstores. They care about what their high status peers in the writing and literary worlds care about. But economics don't care about what your opinions are over the long term. Yeah, let's see. What percent of books sold are online versus bookstores? Online book sales represented 71% of publishing industry's total revenue. So one of my ideas is that there's going to be a flippening. So traditional publishers go hardcover first in terms of status and leading with that, with the pre-sales, then paperback, released often later, and then ebook. I think there's going to be a flippening. I think people are going to put ebooks out or at least retain status, so it's number one in their portfolio. Then it's going to be paperback, driven by decentralized printing and manufacturing, cheaper costs of printing. And then people are going to look at hardcovers as actually high-end collector's items. So I'm actually betting on this. I will be releasing a super high-end version of the Pathless Path. And so my idea is I'm going to compete with what traditional publishers say is their strategic advantage. We are the best at hardcovers. I'm going to compete directly with them, but do something much sexier and nicer. It's going to be color. It's going to be lay flat, beautiful designs, cloth linen cover. So that's sort of my idea, which is like, okay, if I have a hit in my portfolio, then I'm going to put out the high-end hardcover collector edition. And I think that's going to become a lot bigger trend.
I think that's the right way to think about it. And there's a lot of people who are publishing super high volume that way, actually. Like if you're just publishing ebooks, some of these romance novelists are cranking. They publish a book every month, but they do digital only. And that's just how their audience reads. And that's like a whole different breed of author.
And so I think looking to romance is really smart because that's the same thing that happened with paperbacks. So be like the romance author. So my next book is probably going to be like a sexy man on the front of a cover.
That one will be called Hard Work.
Exactly. That's great.